Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Jack Threlfall Show. This is the interview segment for this week's episode, and we are joined by a very, very special guest, YouTuber Josh Revell. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thanks for inviting me on, man. It's good to be here.
So, Josh, could you explain a little bit about what your role in motorsport is at the moment and what a kind of work week looks like for you, how you approach motorsport?
Yeah, so I'm a content creator, a YouTuber that covers mainly Formula One, but also sort of motorsport in general. I try and bring it across in a sort of, I guess, I don't know what you would describe it, lighthearted way, casual, I think is more appropriate. Because of course, a lot of the time the sport is too serious about itself, and I think it's good to sort of just step back and just it's just a sport at the end of the day. Let's just enjoy it, take humor out of it. And, so I try and pitch it across in that way. And obviously it's something that people appreciate because it's, it's gotten relatively popular. It's like 317,000 subs right now, which is decent size for a channel. So yeah, it's a unique channel for sure. That's not quite done in many other places at the moment, and sure wasn't done at the very start.
Absolutely. So at the very start, I mean, I suppose no one ever really has in their mind the full extent of how successful your channel has been when they start. But what was it like uploading your first video? What was in your mind? Was the path as a content creator there, or was it purely just a kind of motorsport fan looking to make his videos and just get started kind of organically?
Well, the first one I made was not sort of anything like what I would do, it was 2018, I think it was, and it was meant to be a sort of serious look at the Andrea Motor Formula One team, because there were no videos at all on Andrea Motor. I thought, okay, why don't I just do it myself? So I put it up there with a rubbish microphone that was about equivalent of £5 and was broken in half, and put it out there. It sort of did nothing, and then 6 months later, for whatever reason, it blew up and went viral. And it's like, okay, I didn't expect that. I'm like, let's run with it. But I knew that I didn't want to do the serious style anymore. And I think as you watch that video, progressively, it just gets more and more stupid. So I was like, okay, there are some influences out there of channels that do a particular formula that I want to sort of approach. So I know what I'm looking for in terms of formula, and I initially had a video scheduled for September, I think, of 2019, where it was on UGE Day, one of the worst Formula One drivers of all time. But surprise, surprise, the file corrupted as I was about to export it. So I ended up just making something short and sweet, which was on the first Austrian Formula One track. Released that, and since then I was just making vids on sort of stuff that I wanted to see out there, not just from the style of content, but also just on the topics as well, because there are a lot of topics out there that just were not covered, and even still today there are. That's sort of what I've always been about.
I was just going to say, as a kind of platform for fascinating, kind of weird and definitely humorous stories, motorsport serves to almost promote those, because it is a very unique world, a very kind of weird and definitely a wonderful world. Everything that goes into it, from team politics to the technical elements. When you look to like why you're a fan of racing, what drew you to not only make videos, to make motorsport videos, was it just from a fan perspective? This was something you had knowledge on, something you had plenty of opinions on, and wanted to get involved in? What do you think it is about motorsport stories that attracted you so much?
I mean, really, I think it's just something which I have comfortable knowledge on, like, I mean, I've obviously got interest in a lot of things, of course, but, motorsport is something that, I'm obviously confident in having sort of sufficient knowledge in, because I've been around it since I was 4 or 5 years old, and, competed in it,
Oh, really?
Sponsored drivers, been around the paddock enough times to sort of know how the world actually works, which is extremely different from what is portrayed on the screen. It was something like, okay, I'm confident enough to, say that what I'm broadcasting is an informed opinion sometimes, Yeah, but also there were, again, just so many stories like that no one really talked about. It's amazing how many stories there are out there of just some of the most wacky stuff ever. Like 1953 Le Mans, for example, where the winners of the race were kicked out 24 hours before the race was meant to start. They went out and had drinks in the evening, were up all night, and then were found and said, "Oh, you're back in the race." They go back out there having not slept for 48 hours. They were filling up on brandy during the whole race, and they go on to win it. Like there's just so many just weird, wacky stories out there that just need to be told. So I think it was just a sort of a perfect storm, I guess. Like sort of lots of great stories, good knowledge of the sport, a desire to make videos and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess it's how it was all born, I guess.
And bringing in the role of animation and how that kind of is a huge part of your channel now, the little cartoon guy at the side, bouncing around the screen and adding that element into it. I suppose to a large extent that, comes from trying to create your own style, trying to create content that is engaging and more than just a kind of slideshow of pictures and videos with some narration, but trying to create something that represents your voice a bit better and adds a little bit something extra to the videos. With animation, was it something that you always had a skill for, or is it something that you felt that you've learned and improved with as your channel's grown?
I mean, obviously it wasn't something I was really apt with, because in the beginning it was actually using Bitmojis, because of course I had no money to get even the most remedial of graphics tablets, which were only about 50 quid. But I mean, I didn't even have enough money for that back then. It kind of tells you where I was at that stage. But yeah, like it is a bit funny how it was all born. It all has sort of evolved, but yeah, creating new cells whilst making new videos is tricky because it's all time consuming.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, it's sort of just stuff that I've gradually gotten to grips with, while I can. I mean, I wish I had more time to delve into the animation part of it, because it's just, anyone who does animation like this will tell you just how time consuming it is. And especially when you're trying to produce a video every week, animation's down the bottom of my list, because, you're researching for a video, you're scripting it out, it's got to go through a revision. You do the audio, edit the audio, and video editing, and that's really 6 days. You got to get it done by. And these videos run for about sort of averaging about 12 minutes, something like that. So, yeah, it's hard to find time to put in the animation in that time. But yeah, it is a style that was influenced by a few YouTube channels that I saw. I was like, okay, I'd like to do something like that, because it's got something about it for sure that sort of makes it more fun, fluid than if I were to do it on camera. I thought, well, yeah, let's try it out. It's something I want to do. And obviously it was well received, obviously.
Absolutely. And speaking of animation, one thing I did want to touch on quickly were the Cars movies, and some of your most successful videos are about that, trilogy, where one of the films stands much below, I suppose, the other two in quality. But I think more kind of broadly, the fact that you're expanding the content beyond just stories from racing, but to just sort of racing media in general, and also the relationships people have with racing media. I suppose in the context of the Cars movies, I think in your video you spoke about how the first one was really influential in developing a passion for motorsport. And I think lots of other young kids can see that movie and understand the stories behind racing. And it really stands up in this example as a great bit of content. For those videos specifically, was it just something that you thought would be a good idea? And did you know that they would be received so well, especially the one about the third Cars movie?
Yeah, I think movie reviews, which ironically the next video I'm releasing is a movie review as well. I really wanted to do them because a lot of these films had sort of an influence in my younger years about, how I viewed motorsport and how it just sort of dug up the passion for it. So take Driven, for example. It was a weird, wacky movie, but it was it had its own sort of appeal. And as a result, I sort of just hung on to that for however long. Yeah. And the Cars movies. Yeah. I mean, obviously, they were what I grew up with. They were my childhood. And obviously, I sort of wanted to talk about them. The first one, I figured it will do relatively well, and it did much better than I thought it would. Then I did Cars 2, which I thought was just not a good film at all. And obviously, some people took strongly to that one. And then the third one, which I thought, okay, it'll do relatively well, ended up being just stratospheric. I think it did sort of tap into, what you were saying earlier on about sort of what those films meant to a lot of young racing fans. So I never set out to sort of make something that was like I thought it was going to be successful. It was more what it sort of meant to me and what I thought I could create a good video out of. It just so happens that, there are a lot of people that thought the same way, I guess.
And it seems like the official NASCAR series is taking some lessons from the third Cars movie by adding a dirt oval race back into their schedule. I think the first one was last year, but at the Bristol track, they're adding the dirt oval back into the official NASCAR Cup series. I thought it was a pretty cool step I suppose, it's a little over dramatized in the movie, but in the sense that that's going back to the NASCAR roots, I thought it was really interesting that the official NASCAR series had taken a similar step in trying to innovate and trying to kind of add a bit of extra, I suppose, weirdness and some kind of new innovation to a series that is kind of stuck on oval and road races. They'd added that dirt element back into their calendar, and to see the Cup Series drivers go back to a lot of them do have those dirt track origins. I thought it was a kind of really interesting storyline in NASCAR that got pursued. So another series I wanted to ask you about on the channel is obviously the WTF Happened to XYZ series, and how that kind of served as a platform to make videos that, largely, I think they kind of, there's an element of like subversion in the videos, because you'll take maybe a figure that there are stereotypes about or kind of a lot of people's opinions about. Two that maybe stand out to me would be, well, I was going to say Mahavir Raghunathan, but I don't think there's much to subvert the stereotype about his driving skills there. But maybe someone like Dan Tickton, where there is a little bit more to the story of just a kind of weird, hot-headed guy, although that does play a big part in the story. With the WTF Happened 2 series, is it the kind of idea of taking a story that not a lot of people know about, but there is so much quality, so much depth there, to bring that to an audience and to show the kind of underrepresented stories, or the stories of the losers or the outcasts, that sort of thing? Is it looking to those kind of marginalized and extreme cases that I think serves the popularity of those videos, or is it just the weird stories and bad drivers and people crashing?
I mean, I think the WTF series sort of, the video serves as a sort of like, it elicits that reaction. You have a look at a lot of those drivers on that list, who have been in the WTF series. A lot of them would sort of elicit the reactions of, oh, they were crap drivers, some of the worst drivers in Formula One. And some others were either successful or sort of just disappeared or whatever. It's meant to elicit that reaction. You're meant to think back on their F1 career and just think, what the hell? Like, what happened to these characters? So you take Ricardo Rosset, for example, and that dude wins a lot of stuff over in Brazil. He comes over to Europe and he gets vice champion in his first year. And what is the equivalent of Formula 2 nowadays? Which for your first year, is quite remarkable. Then he gets to Formula 1, does 2 and a bit years, and is regarded as one of the worst Formula 1 drivers of all time. It's like, what? How the heck did that happen? And especially with Dan Tickton, he's got such a bad reputation in the motorsport sort of circles. But, of course, there's only so much that is sort of publicly known about these characters. There's a lot of stuff that's sort of taken out of context. Not all not all saying that what happened in his Formula 4 days was acceptable, but it's because of what happened back then that people just would not give him a second chance. These WTFs, they're few and far between, but they're meant to sort of elicit the reaction of, like, they'll make you say out loud really what happened to these guys. And so it'll take, something that should have been something and ended up just completely collapsing in and of itself. So yeah, another good one would probably be A1 Grand Prix, which, great concepts, the World Cup of Motorsports. It was something I personally loved. I loved the concept of it. But of course, what was it, 4 or 5 years later, it was involved in this massive corruption sort of a debacle. There were just cancellations after cancellations. People dropped out. It was just a mess. That's sort of where it's all born from. Yeah, I mean, they're in that series for a reason, for sure. They're some of the more unique stories.
And you spoke earlier about, the fact that you were very directly involved with race driving, hands-on in New Zealand, not just kind of looking to Formula One with a fan opinion, but the knowledge of someone who's been very personally integrated into the motorsport industry and the reality of it. You mentioned that the reality often stands in stark contrast to people's expectations and what is put out by the marketing of the series. What was it that taught you that lesson? And in what kind of context did it come?
I guess sort of just understanding the sports politics and just how much money plays a role. And I think I've reiterated the story of Lance Stroll enough. I'm not talking about sort of his driving, but rather just the money that, they were putting in. You hear a lot of stories. It's all paddock chatter. So it's, it's not something you can verify because it would never be verifiable because, it would probably damage the image of the drivers.
Sure.
And just to reiterate, this is not the only driver that does this. I mean, like, a lot of the rich drivers go through the same thing. But, you would just hear just how much money was being poured into some of these kids' careers, about how there were team orders, about how drivers were being brought in to coach drivers. And they knew that these drivers were good, but they just didn't have any money to race. And they said, okay, we'll give you £500,000 and we'll pay for your season, but you got to coach him and you've got to stay behind him for the championship. You just,
wow.
Yeah. Also in certain series over here about how, you look at a driver who won the series and you're like, oh, damn, he's amazing. And then you find out later that his engine had about 60 more horsepower than his competitors. And about how someone's own team would protest against him because of inter-team politics with a driver inside that was, being pushed ahead. It's just, yeah, it's something where it's just like, if you love motorsport, don't get involved in it. There's just so much grimy stuff in it, for sure. I mean, not all of it is as corrupt as that, but once you sort of realize how it all works, you just think, yeah, okay, it's
fair enough. Yeah,
what a sport to get involved in.
Absolutely, there's so many layers that go into everything, and so much that is kept from public eye to protect the people involved. You mentioned earlier that you used to drive as well. What did you drive? What did you race?
It was only competitive karts, if I'm being totally honest.
Yeah.
Such as Rotax back then.
Hey, they're still pretty quick, pretty aggressive, and powerful. Power to weight ratio is pretty hefty.
I mean, the shifting karts, especially, the KZ2s, they're just intense. But like back then, who I was racing against, there were just some intense drivers back in those times. Like, I was just a bit behind with these guys. Like, they were a year ahead of me. But in the same club days, you'd have people like Tom Blomqvist, Nick Cassidy, Mitch Evans,
Oh, wow. Wow,
Andre
yeah, cool.
Heimgardner. Just, there were just these guys that just did amazing. And then you see all these other drivers that were doing equally amazing alongside them that just never had the funds to continue going. But it is ridiculous. Even karting nowadays is ridiculously expensive. Like, you would hear about how in the national events here in New Zealand, how the rich karting families would turn up with like a whole new go-kart for each day, like each of the 3 days.
Oh,
brand new
wow.
sets of tires for each session. It's ridiculous, in retrospect. But, that's motor racing for you, I suppose.
And it was something that I think, looking back, even to some of motorsports legends, I think, well, it was in I don't know, maybe you've seen it. It was a documentary about Martin Brundle and Ayrton Senna's battle in British Formula 3. And it was speaking about how even Senna came from an extremely wealthy family, relative to Brazil, but of course was always had the incredible racing speed to make it happen anyway. But it was something that Senna had kind of championed, in that it shouldn't, the relationship where it's the drivers paying the teams to drive, not like you would have in any other competitive sport where the teams pay their players, or the teams, pay their athlete. The flow of money in motorsport is really interesting. And until you get to really, really high levels, that you become a driver that is desired by teams irrespective of budget, there's a very, very long way before you get to that point. And I think there are stories, like Esteban Ocon, right? People mention Esteban Ocon as a driver who almost rose despite the framing of his family not being wealthy in the same sense. It is ultimately a success story. Do you think that there's a middle ground to be found, or there are positive solutions that could actually exist to change motorsport and to remove that aspect of it that obviously you witnessed very much firsthand, and is still undoubtedly playing a role in global motorsport, if not increasing? What can be done?
I think the reality is that every single racing driver has money in some way, shape, or form. And I think a lot of us hardly have enough to buy a go-kart in the first place, let alone sort of run it in the series. Ocon's story is great, for sure. And there are other stories out there where you hear about how precarious their situations were, but they still made it. And it's inspiring, for sure. But, it's becoming increasingly difficult for those kinds of stories to come about, because the sport is getting more expensive and the world's getting poorer. So, it is a bit more difficult, I'd say, nowadays than it was about sort of 15, 20 years ago. I think even Vettel said recently that if he was racing today, he would never make it to Formula One. It's just too expensive. There are potential avenues with like esports if they do the same thing as what was done with like Jan Mardenborough and James Baldwin, where they gave these kids a chance. They did great in sim racing, and they gave them a chance in real life, and they took the ball, knocked it out of the park, ran, caught the ball themselves.
Esports then is probably the best option of the route out, in terms of the fact that to some extent it reduces the cost, right? Like once you have the rig, obviously I guess iRacing is not a perpetual license. It is something that you kind of have to subscribe to and buy new stuff with, and the costs can rack up pretty quickly there. But they are still ultimately less than what is going to be costing you to compete in real life karting series. So in terms of solutions to that issue, esports probably stands at the top, right?
Yeah. I think it really is becoming more the new grassroots of motor racing, in the sense that, this is where you're going to find a lot of the talent, because there's no real money hindering these guys. And I've met some pretty intensely competitive people in sim racing, And I mean, the esports champion for Formula One, Jarno Opmeer, like, the dude isn't just fast in a sim rig. He's been competitive in real life as well. Like, I think, what was it, in the Formula 4 championship, he was a runner-up to Richard Verschoor, who's one of the most highly rated Formula 2 drivers in the world. It is a bit of a leap from sim racing to real life. It's something that, you know, especially with the cost of motorsports, accessibility, and everything like that, I do hope that more people take it sort of more seriously, and especially given how these sims are becoming more and more realistic, of course.
Absolutely, and it's a world that is quite heavily integrated with YouTube and the online content space. Obviously, when you're dealing with especially F1 esports, you know, there's an idea to kind of turn these guys who are involved much more kind of closely with online racing, obviously, and with the social media side of it. They're kind of primed to be in the position to engage more directly with fans and be more a part of that world than maybe some of the real drivers who can feel disconnected to it, or that it's not kind of something that's as mandatory for them. But for these drivers who, you know, competing in esports, it is so integrated with that online content. I wanted to jump now maybe from simulated racing to the real world of racing and the present context that we're in global motorsport. And starting off with Formula One, we're looking after the Spanish Grand Prix towards Monaco. As we look towards Monaco and the battle between Verstappen and Charles, how do you feel that Monaco is going to add storylines to that? What role do you think it will play in the championship? And ultimately, if you're Charles Leclerc at the moment, how do you get your mind right going in, knowing all the external pressure that exists for him to perform this weekend? I suppose, sorry, the question is, what do you think about the Monaco Grand Prix?
What do I think about the Monaco Grand Prix? Qualifying's great.
Fair enough.
And that's it. Like, I mean, it's like the race leaves a lot to be desired, but, you know, it's funny. Like, they say, oh, you can't pass nowadays. It's like, you couldn't pass at any stage during the damn Grand Prix's existence. Like, I remember, if you watch the 1966 movie Grand Prix, the commentator says it's almost impossible to pass at Monaco. It's like, well, when has it ever been possible to pass at this track then? Like, and back then there were no barriers. So
it's a good point. It's a good point.
I mean, like, if need be, you can go on the footpath if you really wanted to get past Lorenzo Bandini, but nowadays you can't do that. And it's much more close, much more sort of, you're much more cocooned into the circuit. So it's a spectacle above anything else. It's not a great racing track, but qualifying is still one of the greatest spectacles of the year because they're right, 10 tenths up against the barriers, absolutely pushing the limits of both the car and the track and of themselves, which is obviously what you want to see. It's pure, in the sense of there's no runoffs. Like if you get it wrong, there's just Armco for you. If you hit it hard enough, the Mediterranean.
Absolutely. And with more kind of specifically in the context of the championship this year, with Verstappen leading it now and Charles coming off a really unfortunate power unit DNF. Obviously, Max won it last year from what was effectively pole because Charles didn't make it to the start of the race. How important do you think it is for Charles Leclerc to almost close that storyline and maybe answer some doubters after we've seen him make a few mistakes so far in this year's championship, but something that to some extent is going to happen to every driver? But for Charles specifically, do you think Monaco is almost a monkey on his back?
Well, I mean, it would be, wouldn't it? Like, hasn't even finished a race in any capacity at his home track. Like, it's obviously, it's got to be playing on his mind. I think heading into this round, Ferrari will be the top dog going into it because it's more handling characterized rather than down to the power of the car. So yeah, it'll be more Ferrari territory, but in this case, Carlos Sainz has something to prove. And Absolutely. I think this will be a round where Carlos will finally suss out his voodoo, I guess. This year's cars are going to bring up some very interesting results here, We already saw some interesting results last year, where Merc were inexplicably slower at that track. Aston Martin were a bit better. McLaren was a bit better as well. Like it sort of just went all over the place. This year might be a bit more exaggerated because new rigs, there's constant changing anyway throughout the grid. McLaren's going back and forth in terms of pace. Like we're hearing that Alfa Romeo are great in the slow speed corners. Well, what's Monaco got a lot of? Slow speed corners. So like it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, it's great to go into a championship not really knowing what's going to happen. It's even better going into a race and not knowing what's going to happen. I think there will be a lot of different things going on this weekend, but when it comes to what I think will play out, yeah, Carlos Sainz will be my sort of pick for victory this weekend.
Interesting. Okay.
Because it typically plays out in these sports storylines. Like there's those sort of 3 or 4 rounds of, oh, they're struggling, or should they be out of a seat, or, has he lost it? All that same sports stories, and then just takes that one good result, and all of a sudden, because people's memories are only as good as the last race,
I think, well, something else more kind of non-specific that I've got written down in my notes is something that came to mind while I was kind of looking forward to Monaco and remembering what I like about the Grand Prix. But I wanted to get your opinion on, do you think that corner names are better than corner numbers? Because Monaco...
Yes.
You do? Okay, why?
Well, I mean, put it to you this way. We all know, for example, what Larascas is at Monaco. Do you know what corner number it is?
Oh, that's a good question.
The thing is with corner numbers is you're having to sort of trace back in your mind, okay, what corner is this? Oh, hang on, is this classified as a corner? Because sometimes things will be classified as corners when they're not, or sometimes they will be classified, or sometimes they won't be classified when they should be. Like for example, at the Red Bull Ring, like,
oh yeah,
how many turns are there? Is the big kink a corner because you do have to turn the wheel? Oh, it's not because it's part of a straight. Is it or is it not? Like because it changes. It changes based on the series. Like different series have different views on how many corners there actually are. Whereas Larascas is Larascas, Cops is Cops. It doesn't change based on what the series sort of perceives it to be. The corner name is the corner name, and it gives the circuit character as well. The commentator saying going into Larascas is a bit more invigorating than saying going into turn 19.
And speaking of Rascas, it was there in 2021 that Kiwi driver Liam Lawson made a pretty exceptional move that caught the eye of many, many people. The attempt, the confidence, and the skill. And also, I think the fairness of racing for both drivers to accept that move probably was on and possible, and to not let it end up in a collision. As we look to the season that Liam Lawson's putting together this year, and of course the kind of baptism of fire that he had last year at the end of the DTM Championship, where I think every single thing you've spoke about so far in terms of the jadedness and the cynicism of junior Formula racing and even the highest levels played out to quite a large extent at the end of the DTM last year. But for 2022, Liam Lawson's Formula 2 challenge, do you think he's got it on to beat Juri Vips to that Red Bull seat? I know in your most recent video that was a definite talking point. But how do you view the development of Liam Lawson's career?
They are so close, Juri and Liam. They both can be in Formula 1. Like, they're just great drivers. It's just that they've had the most rotten luck with regards to machinery. Sometimes they don't help themselves, but I think a lot of drivers do make mistakes. Their problem is that Red Bull also have Jahan Darivala, who's doing decently so far, Ayumu Uwasa, who's doing very good so far, Dennis Hauger, who is drowning, but, they're still there, and Juri was given a sort of ultimatum of just prove you're worthy of a Grand Prix drive. He's ninth in the standings. He's got no wins. Felipe Drugovic is way up the field, and it's very hard to reclaim that amount of lost ground. Liam's closer. He's fourth in the standings. He has got a win. You can all boil it down to luck, but at the end of the day, the driver's standings don't care about how unlucky you were. The driver's standings are the driver's standings. So it'll be interesting though if Liam were to win the championship. Not saying that I think he will, but if he were to win the championship and Yuri was like down in fourth or fifth place, what's Marco going to do? You know,
absolutely.
Your golden child. Now all of a sudden it was beaten out by someone who, you know, when I say that Yuri is the best of the Red Bull juniors, it's not by a big margin. You know, we're talking very fine margins. People nowadays, I think, especially like they have it in their heads that a driver's better than this guy, therefore the other driver's crap. It's like they're all very, very close. You know, the gap between Yuri and Liam is not big at all. You know, you're talking just about intangibles that you really sort of just can't sort of express into words, really. So even though I think Yuri is the better driver than Liam in terms of outright pace, there are just too many times where he ends up planting himself in the sandbox. And do you want that sort of form for your Formula One team? Or would you rather have someone like Liam who'll just pull off these moves and you're just like, it's not going to work, dude. You're going to end up playing straight on. And he ends up pulling it off. It's like, okay, sweet. But yeah, he does need to sort out some things, first of all, such as sort of his qualifying speed. If you can sort those out, though, then New Zealand has its best prospect of a Formula One driver since Mike Thackwell back in 1980. So, yeah.
But what of Felipe Drugovic then? Leading the Formula 2 championship at the moment looks, in most people's minds, to be a pretty outstanding driver and one who's really found himself a connection with the car and a way to deliver speed across a range of different styles of racetrack. But he's not currently attached to a driver program or to an academy. And ultimately, it doesn't look like his progression to Formula One will be possible. So do you think for him, Formula One almost doesn't serve as the same, or sorry, Formula 2 doesn't serve as the same road to Formula 1 that it does for the drivers who are in driver academies and have connections to teams? For Drugovic to win the championship this year, is he really just putting together a resume for another category, maybe something like IndyCar?
It's very difficult when you talk about the driver academies, because who does he run with? Like, who's exactly taking orders right now? There were rumors that he was attached to McLaren, but that fell through, and instead they signed Ugo Ugochukwu, who's a great driver. You know, you just think, why did the McLaren thing fall through? Ferrari are hell-bent on progressing after Leclerc, and no one else really. Alpine have enough troubles trying to progress Oscar Piastri. Williams are just ridiculous with their driver program. I'm not sure what they're trying to achieve with it. And Red Bull are too chock-a-block. There's not a lot of options for junior programs. No, as I say, your memory's only as good as your last race in the sport. So, great event by Drugovic. You know, he's doing very well. He's always been a fantastic driver. It's all about being at the top of the standings after that last round. Who knows? Who knows? If he doesn't encounter any mechanical problems, thanks to that stupidly unreliable Formula 2 car, then consider himself lucky. But yeah, there's a long way to go in the championship for sure. And even though he's doing amazingly well so far, people won't remember him as much if he weren't at the top of the standings come the end of the championship. I may be wrong on that, but it's very, very difficult to see where he would fit in Formula One because there's just no viable options, really.
And we've seen Callum Ilott find, I think, some mild success in IndyCar. Last weekend, I think he had like a P8 or a P9, which was a significant finish for him relative to the equipment and also the craziness that we got in last weekend's IndyCar race. But with the Monaco Grand Prix coming up this weekend, an event that often pairs that in the same period is what the promoters of the race will call the greatest racing spectacle in the world at the Brickyard Speedway, the Indianapolis 500, which is, you know, an event that sits in the Triple Crown of Motorsport, and one that I think pretty much all racing drivers would say that they want to win, bar maybe Lewis Hamilton, who says that he has no interest in it. But when we look, that's what he says. The Indy 500 as a series, as a single event too. How do you view that, both in the context of global motorsport? Do you think that I'm right when I say it exists as the greatest racing spectacle, or is there some competition there?
There's not a lot of competition, you know. Just maybe it's a 24-hour Le Mans, you know, maybe. No Grand Prix, in my opinion, matches it. But as a spectacle, yeah, it's not far off. It's a fair claim, you know, and winning that race is so much harder than what people may think. It's just one of the most deceptively challenging tracks in the world, which is ridiculous. You know, think a 4-corner oval. How hard can it be? A little bit harder than you may think. It really is sort of, you just need to look at the winner's circle of this race to know exactly what company you're putting yourself with. This is a race won by great drivers. Every year I do look forward to it. I look forward to every IndyCar race anyway, but Indy 500 especially, it carries such a weight with it. Like, if you win this, you are in amongst great company. You know, you're witnessing a great driver at work. And especially nowadays with the grid being as competitive as it is, you know, it's just not something you can miss.
Yeah, they're all so close together at the moment in IndyCar. And standing, or should we say sitting at the front of that grid, is Scott Dixon. He will be on Sunday behind the pace car, leading the group around on the front row. He's put it on pole with the fastest ever 4-lap pole speed in the history of IndyCar, 234 miles an hour. Both as a driver, as a sort of a Kiwi driver, but also just a race driver overall. How good is Scott Dixon?
Outstanding, I guess is the way to put it. His forte really is about maximizing potential in the race. Like, he may not have the fastest car in the day, he'll still make something of it. He'll still drag home the points, which is why I need to Google it. Is it a 5 or a 6-time champion? Like,
one thing I do have written down in the notes also is that it was also something that Tom Gaymore, the commentator, or at least the Sky commentator that we have in the UK, kind of fills in the gaps of the American broadcast when they cut to ads and stuff. He's a friend of the show and he's been on before, and he's coming back on after the race to give us a sort of post-race breakdown. But it was something he mentioned in the commentary where experience goes a long way. So this year we've got Scott Dixon, who's 41. We've got Helio Castroneves, who's 41. We've got Juan Pablo Montoya, who's 46. We've got Tony Kanaan, who's 47. And we've got Takuma Sato, who's 45. All of those drivers are taking on what we are in relative agreement of saying one of the hardest challenges in motorsport. Just as a physical challenge, the speed of that race, the intensity of the kind of sensory overload of being on that Brickyard Speedway. Do you think experience is going to play a big role in the outcome of that race and keeping your cool in such an intense situation?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like any other sort of big race, you know, or it's even like being in the final of it's like being in the final of a major sporting event. Like, if you've been there before, you sort of know what to expect. And with these races especially, you know, the big races have weird characteristics about them. Weather conditions, the momentum of the race, generally when cautions would happen. So if you have that residual knowledge and you have that sort of feel for the event, you know how to work that to your advantage. Those drivers that you listed down, they've been doing this for how long? So they know that stuff. And Dixon would know this first and foremost. Yeah, he's starting on pole. He's got a very fast car, but he's also been on pole at Indianapolis before, quite a few times. And he's only won from there once. So there are just no guarantees in this sport, especially not at that race. geez, what was it? 2011, J.R. Hildebrand should have had that race. Last
Oh my
corner,
God,
straight
yeah.
too wide,
Yeah.
gone to the marbles, bang into the wall. Dan Weldon comes through 1,000 yards before the finish line to win. So there's just no let up really in what this race produces. And they know that. They know how to work that to their advantage. So, yeah, experience does play a massive role in that race for sure. So it is where it comes out to shine, I guess, in the sport, is just these races where you can use it to your advantage. Whereas with like Formula One, for example, obviously the more youthful, the better.
And someone that has moved from Formula One to IndyCar, but will be running his first ever Indianapolis 500 this weekend, is Romain Grosjean. How do you think,
Yes.
in his mind, he can approach that race as a newcomer in a relatively experienced field? There's nothing like it. He's run a few oval races now. I think 2 oval races this season, or maybe just 1 in IndyCar. He didn't run the ovals last year, but of course it will be his first Indianapolis 500 this weekend. For Grosjean, can it be anything more than a learning experience? Can he realistically look towards the podium when we've spoke about the role that experience is going to play?
Anything's possible in this race, you know? So I wouldn't rule that out for him. He's with a great team, and I think it's paramount really that they preach to him that, you know, this is an endurance event, really, at the end of the day. It's not like a lot of other indie events where, you know, it's relatively straightforward in terms of strategy and so forth. This just has its own sort of character. And just help him navigate the minefields and just stay on the lead lap and be with the leaders in that last sort of stint, because there will be a caution with X amount of laps to go. Just make sure you're there, you know, and make sure you're best set up for it. It's not about where you are at the start. It's about where you are placed at the end of the race. Yeah, Romain has never been one for cool-headedness. He's a very fast driver, much faster than what his F1 career would suggest. But, you know, keeping a cool head sometimes is a bit of a futile task.
Absolutely. And another driver who's going to be competing in this weekend's Indy 500, and one that is maybe pegged to be kind of in the front line for American potential Formula One drivers, is Colton Herta. And he's running a really, really good championship this year. I think his story particularly is one that really fascinates me, because more than anything, because his dad is his race engineer, and obviously Brian Herta, an ex-driver himself. Having your dad as your race engineer, I think, would be a pretty interesting one. I'm sure my dad might be listening to this right now. I'm sorry, Dad, if you are, but I'm not sure how good we do at that. But Colton Herta starting P25 in that race, it is such a long race. It is an endurance event. There is going to be potential for him to move forward. Do you think, realistically, with maybe a good performance at the Indy 500, it's something that could put him even further on the map of the potential Formula One Andretti team, if not even the other Formula One teams?
Yeah, I think he's already in that sort of ballpark, you know? Like, Colton reminds me... Well, firstly, he reminds me of Carl Grimes on The Walking Dead, but, I mean, he reminds me mainly of someone like a Montoya or a Jacques Villeneuve back in the 90s for IndyCar. It's a sort of unbelievably exciting talent, you know? Let's see how they are in Formula One. When they got to Formula One, they were exciting, they were fast, they were all this stuff, and it's great because you want drivers like that. And Colton really, really, really is just an exciting driver to watch. At the end of the day, you want to see the best drivers in Formula One. And with Ricciardo kind of drowning right now, and McLaren giving Colton some, you know, mileage, I mean, who knows? I mean, like, I'd love to see him in Formula One, but at the same time, IndyCar is so pure, you know? Like, compared to Formula One, which is, you know, comparatively rubbish when it comes to fair racing, you know?
In Formula One,
you're bound by the car. In IndyCar, it's not as bad as that. I mean, obviously, teams and equipment do play a factor, but you can at least do a bit more in IndyCar than you can in Formula One. Colton's just an exciting talent, so I'd love to see him in Formula One. Who knows? We may get our wish.
One last thing that I did want to touch on just before we wrap up was with the growth of your channel, with the really incredible success that you've had. I'm sure you wouldn't want to come out and maybe say it like that, but I will say it as a fan of your content before I reached out to you. First of all, thank you for coming on the show. It's really cool to engage, with content creators that I was just personally a fan of. The fact that I've been able, in the very small way that I have, I've been able to get involved in the community and kind of make connections with people. With the growth of your channel, one thing that did come up was a partnership with the official Formula One YouTube channel, right? And Formula 2 as well. A connection that I'm sure must have been pretty incredible for you to get that kind of notice, to understand that you were, almost desired, right, by the people on that side. They were looking to the content you were making and the role that you were playing in the F1 community as someone that needed a platform, or an even bigger platform to share their ideas and share their content on. What was that like, that whole experience connecting with Formula One corporate as a body?
Well, it scared the crap out of me, first of all. I was like, oh, okay. seeing the email pop up, that was an interesting experience. Their objective really was to reach out to as many sort of fans as they could. And they wanted to collaborate with content creators as well. And I was like, okay, all right, I can run with that. Yeah, and so over a month, it was sort of negotiated what we would do, and they sort of understood what my channel was about. So they did put in the brief, like, don't talk bad about, like, certain drivers, don't talk bad about the series, don't talk bad about the car. It's like, okay, sure, I won't do it on this video for your channel, but there's nothing saying I won't do it on my own channel later on.
Or on this podcast.
I think like the last video especially, I think, has burnt the bridge between myself and Formula 2, because but at the same time, it's a case of, I'm not trying to be that sort of Robin Hood character, but like sometimes I just can't hold my tongue. If a driver who's paying 3 million euros a year has 3 engine failures in 2 races, that's not acceptable. It was interesting. We managed to get it done. It went out, and like, it did very, very well. I think they said it was one of the better performing Formula 2 videos that they ever had, which was great. It was a great advocacy for content creators. But it also spoke about how Formula One is sort of opening themselves up to content creators more, which is great, because they were very closed off before and it just did nothing for them. I don't know if there'd ever be another collaboration, because obviously some of my takes are strong, especially with them. But, like,
I don't think any of them are, like, unrealistic or unfounded when you say that, they're strong takes. It does, you kind of hinted at it there, that while there are so many benefits, I'm sure, not only, just for the growth of your own channel, but personally just to see that, you really made a dent in the content space and gained some power there. But there are downsides to taking on that more corporate voice, and it's a voice that could to some extent be limiting, right?
Yeah.
Limited in what you can talk about.
Yeah. Limited in what you could talk about, limited in what you could do, yes. And I didn't like that idea. I mean, I'm forever grateful that I was given the opportunity, don't get me wrong. But also part of the channel was like, okay, why is saying this thing taboo? Like, why can't you say that this car is crap? Why can't you say that this is unacceptable? Why can't you say that, hey, the title battle last year about Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton? maybe we could just appreciate both drivers. I don't know why that's such a cardinal sin. It's just sort of things where people don't touch upon necessarily, and I don't understand quite why that's sort of viewed that way, I guess. But yeah, I guess it's also part of the reason why I just enjoy doing what I do on my channel, because I've got that free voice. Without being stupid, of course, obviously.
Yeah, and I think that freedom, that openness, and also, it's a freedom that we all experience in forming our own opinions, and it's something that I think fans of your videos really connect to, in that, that it's not limited, right? That it's an opinion. You're pointing out facts that to some extent may seem obvious to everyone, like the role of money in Grand Prix racing, but also things that are unique, things that you've spotted on your own, and that do deliver really valuable insight. I said this for the last question, but this is actually the last question that I wanted to ask. As not only a content creator, but a content creator in New Zealand, I'd love to know a bit more about motorsport in New Zealand, how the kind of fandom of motorsport rests with other sports in New Zealand, and also maybe how it's changed if you have experienced a change. I know global motorsport is expanding Formula One, looking to make a huge dent in the American market, and attendances at Formula One races are going up at every single track. But in New Zealand specifically, what have you seen regarding fandom of motorsport and any changes recently?
With regards to motorsport in New Zealand, the best way I would classify it is that it's extinct in the wild. It's in a bad place, really, with regards to competitions and people competing in it, because there is a lot of mismanagement in the upper echelons of motorsport New Zealand. They're run by a bunch of buffoons, and I'm sure that if this ever got out, that I'd be turned away at the paddock gate. But again, it's sort of something that's echoed in amongst the community, that the mismanagement is so bad that, you just have these low turnouts. No one comes to race meetings. It's a bit of a dead dodo. But with regards to Formula One, yeah, it's obviously getting more popular, as it is almost anywhere else, because of the advent of Drive to Survive. Some of the more pure fans, as they call themselves, would say, oh, I hate these DTS fans. It's like, well, we all got to start somewhere.
Oh, 100%.
We all start as clueless fans at some stage. I mean, who cares? As long as they like the sport, as long as they're invested in it, let them learn in their own time. The important thing is that we're getting new fans. It's better than the Bernie Eccleston days, where it's just like, I'm okay with this one 70-year-old fan. It's like, well, Bernie, one day this 70-year-old fan isn't gonna be here anymore. And what do you do then? And it's seriously, with how Formula One has been now, it's great seeing the popularity of it. I mean, I'm not just saying that because it's increasing ad revenue for my channel, but it's also just down to you just want to see the best for the sport. And we are seeing amazing. I mean, you just have a look at the crowd for the US Grand Prix last year. It was insane. That the whole hill, all the grandstands, everything was filled to the brim. The crowd noise was insane. You want to hear that stuff. You want to hear that 400,000 people packed out this racetrack. I was in Melbourne for the Grand Prix. You couldn't really move, because there were just so many people. You had to get there first thing in the morning, and even then, we were at the gates about half an hour before they opened on race day, and the line was still what was it, about half a kilometer long?
Wow.
It's the interest is definitely there for sure. In New Zealand here, yeah, it is pretty much the same. I mean, even going to the airport, on the way there were just so many people wearing, F1 merch.
Sure, yeah.
And it's so I guess, motorsport in general, yeah, it's drowning pretty badly here, but Formula One is, I wouldn't say it's more popular than it's ever been, because I don't know that. I don't have any stats about that, but,
That's all right, Josh. We can put that.
It's very consistent with everywhere else, where it's just there's been so many new fans, and it's obviously great to see.
And I think one thing I've learned, I can say directly from your videos, while it may be in some people's mind at the moment saying, well, maybe New Zealand should get a Grand Prix, one thing that fans of Josh's will know, New Zealand already has a Grand Prix, right?
We have a Grand Prix, yes. It's
Grand Prix.
using sort of Formula 3 cars, actually the same sort of cars that the W Series drive, which is with it's basically a Formula 3 car with a pencil sharpener engine, but you know it is still it still produces great racing. You know, I'll dig up the list of champions recently because
yeah, there's some proper names on that list.
Yeah, like from 2014 onwards, we've had Nick Cassidy, Lance Stroll, Lando Norris, Jahan Daruvala, Richard Vershaw, Liam Lawson, Igor Fraga, Shane Van Gisbergen. Before that, you had Mitch Evans. You had Keke Rosberg, Chris Amon, Graham Hill, Jackie Stewart, Sterling Moss, John Surtees, Jack Brabham, Bruce McLaren, Sterling Moss. I mean, they're all in it, you know? So you have all these young drivers coming through, and they're all competing in this. And it's sort of like, okay, some of these guys may be in Formula One one day. It still carries quite a lot of, you know, weight to be a champion there.
You know, that is a part of history in motorsport in New Zealand, the fact that there is still a role for it to be played. But it does seem that, you know, you mentioned there a disparity, right, between Formula One increasing in popularity, increasing in engagement and overall kind of viewership around the world, but that carrying over to Australia and New Zealand, but that isn't trickling down to the lower categories, the racing that actually is available outside of people's front doors, or at least the extent to which that's possible in New Zealand. But, you know, that there are motorsport events that are going on. There is competitive racing available to people. But Formula One seems to be almost kind of sucking up all of that attention, and it isn't really filtering down to the other categories. So maybe some room for improvement there and some room for growth. As much as the top categories are growing, there is an element for that grassroots factor to be sustained there.
Yeah, pretty much. I would concur with that. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think we can wrap this interview up there then with a kind of mixed message towards the overall nature of motorsport, but a positive one regarding the future of motorsport's highest levels and some fascinating storylines going on both IndyCar and Formula One and around the racing world. So I'll say a really, really big thank you from me, Josh. Thank you genuinely so much for coming on the show. First, just for answering my my email. I wasn't sure whether it would get lost in the inbox or what would happen. But yeah, genuinely, thank you so much for coming on and making this a really brilliant episode.
No worries. Thanks for inviting me on again.